So let's now make sure that data can be added or items can be added to the cart. And for that, I want to use context. I want to manage the overall cart data through context because we will need it in different places of the application. On the meal items, we need to update the cart, and in the cart component, we need to output it, of course. And we also will need to manage it in the future because inside of that cart, later, the cart items can also be added or removed again. So therefore, let's start by setting up that cart context. And for this, I'll add a store folder side by side to the components and the assets folder. The name is up to you, but since we are going to store our application-wide state here, store is kind of a convention in React world as a name for this application-wide state management. And in there, I'll add a cart-context.js file. The naming of this file is up to you though. In here, I will import React from React because we can then call React create context. And I will initialize this context with some default data, which will not actually be used, but which will give us better auto-completion later. And here we'll have an items array, since we are going to manage a couple of cart items. We'll have a total amount, which is 0, let's say initially. And then we'll have two functions which allow us to update that context. And that's the add item function, which let's say receives the item that should be added. And it's the remove item function, which receives, let's say, an ID to identify the item which should be removed from the cart. Like this. Now I'll store this in a cart context constant, and I will export this cart context here. So that's step number 1. Now we got this context generally created. But now we will also need to manage that context in some component with useState or useReducer, as you saw it earlier in this course, so that this context can also change over time and can update parts of the application over time. And we could do this in the same file here, but I will create a new file for this and name it cartProvider.js. Because in here, I want to add a cart provider component, which receives props, and of course, which I export. And the goal of this component is simply to manage the cart context data and provide that context to all components that want access to it. And for that here, I will import cart context from /cart-context, and then return JSX code, because this is a component, where I simply access cart context.provider. And now we can simply pass props.children between cart context provider. And this allows us to wrap any components that should get access to this context with this cart provider component. And we can also add all the logic for managing the context data to this component, so that all about that is contained in one component and no other component needs to deal with that. Now for that, I will add a cart context helper constant in this component function. And that is simply an object with items, total amount, so all the fields we set up for the context itself. This will be the concrete context value though, which will also be updated over time. And this also holds pointers for the add item function and for the remove item function. And we can already add these functions here and add a add item to cart handler here, where we get the item and then do something with it in the future, and the remove item from cart handler function, where we get the ID and do something with it in the future. And now it's simply pointers at these functions which are stored as values for add item and remove item in this card context object. And it's now this card context object here, which is set as a value or as a value for the value prop on the card context provider component here. And again, this will be dynamic soon. It's not right now, but it will be dynamic soon. And with that added, we can now use this card provider component to wrap all components that need access to the card. And in our application, that's actually all the components which are rendered in the app component. The card, of course, needs access to render the card items and also to edit them later. The header needs access to update this badge in the header button, this badge where we output the number of card items. So the header also needs access to the card. And the meals need access to the card because there we want to add items to the card. So therefore, we can replace this fragment here with card provider as a wrapping component. And of course, we should now also import card provider from the store folder and then the card provider file. And we can remove the fragment import. Now we could manage that entire context also in the app.js file therefore, since we need it in all the components there. But by using a separate card provider component, we keep the app component lean and don't have to put all the card management logic in there. Simply imagine that you're working on a bigger application with different app-wide states. Let's say you have a product state and a card state and a user state and anything like that. If you would manage all of that in the app component, it would become super large. So having dedicated store components which manage that makes a lot of sense. Now with that, we provide that context to all these components. Now we can leverage it. For example, in the header card button, there we needed to update the appropriate amount of card items in that batch. And hence what we can do is we can use the context in there. So therefore, definitely try using that context on your own. In the next lecture, we're going to do it together.